Mr.
Good morning, my lady. May I please call Rachel Elizabeth Lloyd?
I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that
the evidence I shall give
the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but
the truth.
Thank you. Please.
Can I check that you're commonly known as Liz Lloyd?
I am indeed.
There's a few preliminary matters I wanted to discuss with you before we get to the substance of your evidence. Can you keep your voice up and can you speak slowly because there's a stenographer that is taking the evidence. And if any of my questions are unclear, please say so and I can repeat or rephrase. You've provided two statements to the inquiry. The first, and both of these statements are dated the 15th of November 2023. The first statement is on screen. This is INQ 000274006. And this is a statement that explains your role in the Scottish Government's response to the pandemic. I understand that there was a correction that you wanted to make at is it to paragraph 13?
Paragraph 13, yes. There's a fairly, I hope, obvious typographical error. I have used the date late 2020, early 2021, when that should be late 2019, early 2020.
I'm obliged. I think it was obvious to the inquiry that you were talking about 2019 into 2020. So, subject to that amendment, can you confirm that this is your statement?
It is.
And are the contents of this statement true to the belief of your knowledge, true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
They are.
There's also a second statement that you gave to the inquiry, which is also dated the 15th of November 2023. This is INQ 000274004. And this is a statement about the use and retention of informal communications, such as WhatsApp messages. Can you confirm that this is your statement?
It is.
Are the contents of this statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
They are.
Thank you. I wanted to move on now to discussing your professional background before we get to your role during the pandemic. You were employed as a special advisor to the Scottish Government from January 2012 to, I believe, the 23rd of March 2021. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then after a short break, you were back in post as a special advisor from August 2021 to around the 28th of March 2023. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you served as the Chief of Staff to the then First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, from January 2015 to the 23rd of March 2021.
Yes,
Is that
that's
correct? And then you returned to the Scottish Government, as we've said, in August 2021. And this time your role was as Strategic Political and Policy Advisor to the First Minister within the Special Advisor team. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And you remained in that role until the resignation of Nicola Sturgeon as First Minister of Scotland at the end of March 2023, at which point you also chose to leave government. Is that correct?
That is indeed.
And you now work in the private sector, I understand.
Yes, I do.
And I want to turn to ask you about the role of special advisors more generally before we get to your involvement in the pandemic. There is a special advisor's code of conduct. Is that correct?
There is, yes.
And this describes the role of a special advisor as adding a political dimension to the advice and assistance available to ministers. And the code notes that one of the reasons for the role is to reinforce the political impartiality of the permanent civil service so that the political advice can come from the special advisors as opposed to the permanent civil servants. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And Professor Paul Kearney gave evidence in week 1 to the inquiry. And in his report, he says that special advisors are appointed by the First Minister personally, and ultimately the responsibility for the management of the special advisors rests with the First Minister. Is that your understanding?
That is correct. I would say the day-to-day management of the special advisor team is delegated to the Chief of Staff.
Yes, but ultimately
Ultimately,
responsibility rests with the First Minister. In your first statement, you say, and I'll simply quote at this stage, special advisors are not decision takers but support the decision-making process by supporting ministerial thinking and assist in the application, understanding of and communication of ministerial decisions. Therefore, am I correct to understand that the role of a special advisor is not to take the decisions themselves?
That is correct, yes.
And there has to be clear boundaries between the decision makers, such as the Scottish ministers, and special advisors, as it's only the ministers who are elected and therefore accountable to the public. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And as special advisors, you're neither elected nor accountable to the public.
That is broadly correct, yes. I always felt accountable to the public.
But in terms
not
of the formal,
formally.
not formally. And your role is generally not meant to be public-facing, unlike the politicians, is it?
That's correct.
And some special advisors can build up close relationships with their ministers, having worked with them over many years. Is that correct?
That is.
And is it fair to say that your relationship with Nicola Sturgeon was particularly close, having worked as her Chief of Staff since 2015?
Yes, and certainly by the time of the pandemic.
And is it fair to say that you were one of her closest confidants?
Yes, I would say so.
Can we turn to your first statement, which is on the screen now? It's paragraph 29 and page 8. And here you say, my advice during this period was on the general tenor of the actions being taken, managing public response and the communication of the actions being taken. I played a role on the First Minister's behalf in asking clinicians and officials for more and better advice and raising questions on further action, and acted as a sounding board, thought partner for the First Minister and others. Are you able to tell me what you mean by thought partner?
Ministers, the First Minister, but other ministers as well, would receive advice from scientists. They would be looking at, broader information on legislative proposals, policy proposals, and sometimes ministers need a place or a person where they can essentially think out loud without that being taken as their definitive view. So my role and the role of other special advisors frequently is to engage with them, to help them stress test ideas, to talk out what might the consequences of a particular route of action be, help them come to, are there other questions they should ask? Do they have all the information they need? And to help them explore, if you like, the advice and information before them.
So in the context of a particular decision that the First Minister or another minister needs to make, there may be competing considerations, there may be competing almost briefings coming from different interests, whether it be economic, whether it be scientific or medical. And part of the role of the special advisor is to be able to almost stress test the different, perhaps conflicting advice so that the minister can make the decision.
Yes.
In your statements, and I won't take you to this particular part, but I think you say that it would be normal for you to attend decision-making meetings with the First Minister where she was in attendance. And this included meetings of the Scottish Government Cabinet, the Scottish Government Resilience Room, the Gold meetings, Cobra meetings, and the Four Nation calls with Boris Johnson and Michael Gove. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So it's fair to say that you were a particularly important part of the Scottish Government's response to the pandemic until at least March 2021. Is that correct?
That's for others to judge, but I was certainly there and certainly participating in the response.
You were there in almost all the important
Yes.
meetings and in the rooms where the decisions were being made?
Yes.
And you were the thought partner or the sounding board for the First Minister when it came to stress testing perhaps the different conflicting advice that was being received?
Yes.
And there would be, I think, is it fair to say, there'd be very few people within the Scottish Government that would perhaps be in the room for all the key meetings with the First Minister during the course of the pandemic?
During the course of the pandemic, it was common there would be a few other people that you would see at most of the meetings. So the Cabinet Secretary for Health would be present very frequently. The Deputy First Minister was present a lot, sometimes remotely, because for reasons he would be working from home. Ken Thompson, the Chief Medical Officer, or one of the other medical advisors. But there was a core group who were in St Andrew's House a lot and in a lot of those meetings together.
And you were part of
And I
that
was part
core
of
group?
that, yeah.
Can we turn to your first statement, and it's at paragraph 36, page 9. And here I think you say, I would not say I advised on the adoption or not of specific NPIs, it's non-pharmaceutical interventions. That was for the clinicians and officials, but I would have given views at certain points on the interpretation of the data, of public mood and compliance, of communications, and where there was politics involved, for example, securing the support of other parties or governments, or impacts on stakeholders, such as through border controls, on that aspect. So, is it your position that you did not advise on the adoption or not of specific NPIs?
I think when certain NPIs were on the table in that thought partner role, there would be perhaps conversations between myself and the First Minister as to which ones, or exchanges as to which ones to use. That could perhaps be considered advice on the adoption, but it was not. I think what I meant is I didn't decide on the adoption.
Yes, so you advised, but I think your position, I think more accurately, is you didn't make the ultimate decision.
Yes, nor did I sort of say, here is your selected list of NPIs. They would come in proposals from the Chief Medical Officer, for example, and we would then discuss the kind of things that were on the table.
Can we turn to some WhatsApp messages that you have disclosed to the inquiry between yourself and Nicola Sturgeon? I will come back to the circumstances of the disclosure later on. Okay. But first of all, can we turn to INQ 000287766? And we're looking at page 9. And by way of context, the Scottish Government announced the rules that permitted 20 people at funerals, weddings and civil partnerships. And those rules kicked into force on the 14th of September 2020. And Nicola Sturgeon was due to announce new restrictions to the Scottish Parliament on the 22nd of September 2020. And in fact, the usual briefing time was changed from 12:15 that day to 2:20 that afternoon. And here we have an exchange of messages. This is shortly before Nicola Sturgeon was due to make the announcement about the new restrictions that day. And this exchange relates to a discussion about whether the rules should be changed for weddings, civil partnerships and funerals. If we start by reading the top message, so Nicola Sturgeon says, and this is on the 22nd of September at 12:09, so shortly before she's due to make the public announcement, we haven't thought about weddings. They are reducing, but not sure what to. And you reply, I think as we only just put them up, just leave it. Then you go on to say, they aren't reducing churches, etc., as far as I know. And I think, though we'll check, that they were higher than us. And then you say, they had 30, we have 20. Then you say, they are going to 15 and 30 at funerals. I think we stay at 20. Does the they in this conversation refer to the UK government?
Yes, it does.
So Nicola Sturgeon in this example tells you at around 12:10, the day that she's due to make the announcement to the public, the usual time being 12:15, but this day we see that it was moved to 2:20. She tells you that she's not sure about what to do. And you tell her to stay with 20 attendees when the UK government has gone down from 30 to 15. And that ultimately becomes the decision that day, because there is no change to the position of 20 as far as the inquiry is aware. So is this not an example of a decision that was made very much at the last minute over WhatsApp between you and Nicola Sturgeon?
So there are a number of aspects to this exchange. The decision, I don't view this as the decision because the decision had been taken. So a decision had been taken at Cabinet to go to 20 through the normal processes. And where the First Minister is saying we haven't thought about weddings, there had been significant thought by, I think, the Communities and Equalities team about what were the appropriate numbers of people at particular services. So that decision had been taken, that decision had gone through the proper process. And I give my view that I don't think we need to essentially remake that decision. I think the message underneath that says that the statement is being forwarded to her, which is, I think, the Prime Minister's statement. And had she still wanted to take further action, she could have come back on that. I also think behind this WhatsApp, if you like, I was having an exchange with the lead official to make sure I had the information correct and that the information I was giving the First Minister was the right information.
Is a decision not to change the rules still a decision?
I think there had been a positive, if you like, and a proactive decision at Cabinet that the position in Scotland was that there would be 20. There is neither a confirmation or, if the First Minister had come back and said, I agree, then I would support your view that that was a decision. She actually doesn't comment, and there may be other actions elsewhere. I don't think it did change from memory until later on. But this, to my mind, is me giving my advice, my thought, in that thought partnership role that we stay at 20. If she had wanted to pursue it, to consider it further, perhaps after receiving the statement she may have, there would be exchanges in some other fashion.
There wasn't any scientific briefing that you received that appears to have informed your view, let's stick with 20, was there?
There would have been on the decision which had very recently, I think that, a day or two before, been taken to set it at 20.
I believe that the decision to move it down to 20 had been taken around maybe the 10th of September, and the decision had come into force on the 14th of September. And what we are talking about is here looking at the 22nd of September, and from the documents that have been disclosed to the inquiry, between the inquiries looked at all of the documents between the 10th of September and the 23rd of September, and the inquiry can see no advice being given between these dates about whether the number should remain at 20 or whether it should go up or down. So is this not an example of a decision simply being made on the hoof shortly before the First Minister is meant to be announcing restrictions?
I would think that advising that shortly before the statement on restrictions was about to be made, that a decision should be taken to change the limit without seeking scientific advice would have been the on the hoof aspect. Suggesting that you stick at the decision that had been taken based on information was a more coherent position.
But we can see that Nicola Sturgeon's first WhatsApp to use, we haven't thought about weddings. That seems to suggest that there wasn't really much thought process that had gone into the decision until this exchange with you, which begins at around 12:10.
No, I think she means we haven't thought about changing weddings, if you like, in response to the UK government changing weddings. We had thought about weddings when the decision had been taken positively and proactively in Cabinet to set the limit at 20.
So is it fair to say that because Nicola Sturgeon comes to you not being sure what to do, and ultimately, as the inquiry has seen, that on this date there was no change to the rules, and you're the one that suggests that we stay at 20, are you effectively the main driver of this decision?
No, I don't think so. If the First Minister has a strong enough mind that if she had felt that my advice was not the right advice, she would have said so, or she would have acted in another capacity, asked for further advice, delayed the position on weddings. She would have acted on that. I am advising. I sought the correct information, if you like, on the factual basis to give that advice, but the decision is very much his.
If these messages had been deleted by you, and they haven't because that's why we have them, if these messages had been deleted by you, how would the inquiry and the public be able to understand how and why the decision was made at this time not to change the number of people that can attend funerals or weddings?
So, as I've said, in this regard, I have recollection of contacting, I think on Teams, the official responsible for the sort of framework documents, if you like, to check my facts, to check what it was. They would be able to see the decision that was made, which was the decision to stay at 20 being made previously, essentially the decision to set at 20, through the process of advice and Cabinet papers. So that decision would be set out in very great detail. The exchange I will have had with the official will have said the First Minister is asking about weddings. What's the position?
But ultimately, the public, if this message had been deleted, the public would, and the inquiry would not know that the decision ultimately, the First Minister, as at 12:10 that day, wasn't sure what to do. And in fact, within a couple of hours when she announced the restrictions, she'd reached a view that the numbers would not be changed. And all of that had occurred within a very short time, involving a WhatsApp discussion with you. That wouldn't be the sort of insight that the public or the inquiry would have if these messages had been deleted. Is that correct?
I think there may not be the insight into, if you like, the moment of, oh, should we think about this? the reflection on, is the advice that we have at the moment the correct advice? But they would know why the decision on weddings was that there should be 20 people.
And the reflection is part of the decision-making process, isn't it?
It can be. I think in this it is are the UK doing something that we should be doing? That will be, I would expect to find in notes from officials providing this is what the UK is doing and considering in slower time, perhaps before the next update of the regulations, should we adopt any of this? But that split second, if you like, of indecision would not necessarily be recorded elsewhere.
But so, can I just confirm, so do you agree with me that this would be an important part of the specific decision that was under contemplation here on this date, this exchange?
I think if it had been, I don't want to dispute this too strongly, but I don't want to state the importance of this particular decision. There had been every week there was a review of what the decisions were, what the appropriate steps were, what actions should be taken. And they were done in a very meticulous fashion. And there will be occasions where people have a moment of, oh, is that right? And they might ask a special advisor, they might ask a policy official, they might ask the clinical advisor that happens to be in the room with them. Those moments are quite human. But I wouldn't want to overstate the importance of this as opposed to the importance of the proper process that was followed that set the limit at 20, because that was a very diligent process.
Both processes, the formal and the informal, have their place, don't they?
They do.
The decision-making process. And part of it is you've got the formal frameworks, whether it's a cabinet, but you've also got the human side that you've touched upon, which is as being a thought partner or a sounding board, where you get to see people's real, maybe struggles with the decisions that they're making, needing different viewpoints and insights. And together that forms the full context to that decision, doesn't it?
Yes, I think there can be moments where a bit of perhaps reassurance is required, or making sure that we essentially don't take informal decisions when formal decisions have been taken. So had there been a decision here to change, that would have been a decision based on no scientific advice at all, taken in the space of 20 minutes. When you have a full proper process, this is essentially deferring back to the proper formal process.
The formal process, which I think in this instance had occurred about 12 days before, or
yes.
there or thereabouts.
Yes.
Can we turn to INQ 000287766? This is again your WhatsApp messages. We're looking at page 35.
So could that be made just a touch bigger?
I think they will hopefully come on screen a little bit bigger.
A little blurry.
We are looking at, does that help?
Yes, that does help.
Thank you. Helps me as well, so I think we can both read. So this is a discussion between you and Nicola Sturgeon about the number of people who could meet indoors from March 2021. So if we look at the first message, it's from you saying, when you respond on cabinet paper in June, could we make it 6 and 3 indoors? It's just much more normal. Can I just pause there? What's the significance of the number 6 and 3?
I believe that would be 6 people, 3 households.
And then if we, Nicola Sturgeon's replies, that will be better after 4 and 3 mid-May, I assume. You reply saying indoors, April 4-2, May 6-2 is what I currently have. Nicola Sturgeon replies, is that indoors in pubs, etc.? Thought we were waiting till May for indoor households. You reply saying we appear to be waiting till June for indoors at home. You also reply, so in pubs, etc., it's 4-2 in April, 6-2 in May, and then in June, it should go to 6-3, and we allow you to meet in your own home. You reply, you again say, cabinet paper doesn't actually run all the way to June, but my mock graphics do. Nicola Sturgeon replies, we should bring indoor houses to mid-May. You reply saying, can you make that your feedback, or do you want me to do it? Yeah. And she replies, I'll do it. So if we pause there, in this exchange, you are pushing for, or maybe advising. That there is a change of the rules on the amount of people who can socialise indoors. Is that right?
So this refers to a proposal. So the numbers 4-2, 6-2, I'm not just pulling those out of the air. This is a proposal in a draft of a cabinet paper and in a draft set of communications material that I am looking at. And suggesting to the First Minister that I don't think the final part of the proposal, which is not in the Cabinet paper but is in these communications materials, doesn't really work, in my view.
I think your reasoning given is it's just much more normal. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Sometimes when you looked at the advice that was given, you had to think through what will this mean for people living their lives in practice, and how might people want to function, what would people consider a return to normality if that's what you're trying to do. And although we had previously had 6.2 regulations, I think the year before, I actually think what I was reflecting on here was 6.3 possibly enabled more of a sort of families to gather in a slightly easier way.
But I think you accept, or would you accept that the explanation being it's just much more normal isn't very scientific, is it?
It is not, I agree, it is not hugely scientific, but one of the things that you have to do, or that certainly I felt was necessary in this, and this was not a function unique to me, is to think when you have a set of regulations that are not proposed. It often felt like they were proposed in the abstract without considering the way in which people function in their real life, and particularly around how people interact with each other. You were seeking to balance caution and protection from the virus with the kind of normality that might be good for people in a more societal sense.
Was that a consistent theme up till your involvement till March 2021, that the advice that you were, scientific and medical advice that you were receiving, often seemed very much in the abstract, devoid of kind of the real world and how people live?
I don't want to suggest that the people giving the advice were sort of abstract and devoid of understanding, but it was their job to provide, what is the appropriate regulation on a very strict basis. It was not their job to consider what does this mean for people's mental health, what does it mean for their family relationships. They were there to consider what will keep the R number to its lowest level, if you like. There were other people who would feed in points about, well, actually, if you could make a slight tweak to that, does that make it better for people societally or in a mental health sense? And what's the impact of that on, does that have serious consequences? Is that a move we have space to make, if you like?
So it wasn't strictly the case that the Scottish Government was following the science, because the science had a role to play, but there was this other element that you would, for instance, and other special advisors and indeed other stakeholders would bring into the decision that wouldn't necessarily be science-based.
I think the science underpinned everything. And if you suggested changes, if ministers wanted to do something different, there would normally be a sort of referral back to see if we could calculate what that might do. If a minister proposed something that would push the R number, or that would be calculated or modelled to push the R number above, then that would likely not be taken forward. So you were underpinned by the science and, if you like, cautioned by the science in how far you could go.
But not necessarily, the science wasn't the be-all and end-all of the Scottish Government's approach.
It was dominant, but I don't think you can take decisions in this situation without being aware of other factors.
And what we see here in this exchange is that there is a decision to go to Cabinet with, I think, what yourself and the First Minister have discussed, and that's going to be Nicola Sturgeon's view presented to Cabinet in terms of the change of rules.
Well, this confirms that it's going to be her feedback to the Cabinet paper. That would create an opportunity, if the clinicians, for example, thought that was inappropriate, for them to come back on her feedback, and this would all be informal exchanges if they did this, to say, First Minister, actually, we would rather not do that, and this is why we would rather not do that.
Is it fair to describe the role of the Scottish Cabinet at times as being a decision-making ratifying body as opposed to a decision-making body? So it ratified decisions that had been made elsewhere, whether it's in informal communications, whether it's in Gold Command meetings, or in other one-on-one discussions between key decision-makers, and the role of Cabinet was at times simply just to ratify those decisions?
No, I don't think so. I think everything that went to Cabinet was a proposal, and Cabinet ministers would push back sometimes, ask for amendments, ask for changes. Some decisions may be deferred because cabinet members wanted more information or the First Minister wanted more information. There was an extensive process of engagement with clinicians, advisors and cabinet ministers before the cabinet paper would come to cabinet. So there would be opportunities prior to cabinet for people to feed in, but there would also be genuine discussion at cabinet.
And would there often be instances where the ultimate decision was delegated by cabinet to, for instance, Nicola Sturgeon or John Swinney?
There were certainly occasions where cabinet would agree to delegate a decision, yes.
And what sorts of decisions do you recall that were delegated to Nicola Sturgeon or John Swinney during your involvement in the pandemic?
Decisions that were delegated tended to be sometimes in the relationship to the communications around a decision, sometimes in relation to the timing of the announcement of a decision, and sometimes where an additional piece of information or a piece of analysis was to come in, and cabinet members would have the chance to put their views in writing or to speak directly to the First Minister, but there would not be another cabinet meeting called. If, for example, you had the cabinet meeting, say on the Tuesday, and you were looking at something that you might announce on the Thursday and an additional piece of information was requested, you wouldn't necessarily recall cabinet. The final decision would be delegated to the First or Deputy First Minister, but cabinet members would have the opportunity to comment on the additional information that came in between.
Was an example of a decision that was delegated to Nicola Sturgeon or maybe perhaps John Swinney around the local restrictions? You'll remember when the level system came in and decision making around, for instance, whether Glasgow would remain in level 3 or 2 or Edinburgh would go up or down. Is that the sort of detail that was delegated to the First Minister to make?
You would have a broader discussion around what the levels would be, but the final check, if you like, on the morning of the announcement against that day's figures would be delegated. So to check that there wasn't a need to adjust, if you like, what had been agreed in the broader discussion.
That's maybe an issue that we'll explore with further later witnesses. I wanted to turn to the political strategy behind the Scottish Government's response to the pandemic. Is it fair to say that you've spent a lot of your career, perhaps less so now, strategising about Scottish independence?
I think supporters of Scottish independence might be disappointed with what my answer is, but not as much as people would have thought or would have liked. A large part of my political career has been spent strategising about what the Scottish Government does in other policy areas. But yes, I have had a role throughout in the progress of Scottish independence.
And how many years would you say that you've had a role in the strategy for independence?
Probably from around about 2012.
Can we turn to the Cabinet Minute from the 30th of June 2020? If we look at the first page, you'll see that this is a Cabinet meeting which is attended by everyone in terms of the Cabinet Secretaries that you would expect, including the First Minister, and you're also in attendance as you're noted as a special advisor. Can we turn to page 13, paragraph 56E? And you'll see here that one of the Cabinet conclusions is, if it can be, thank you, if I can read, it says, agreed that consideration should be given to restarting work on independence and a referendum with the arguments reflecting the experience of the coronavirus crisis and the developments on EU exit. So this is a Cabinet conclusion, and it's from the 30th of June 2020. Are you able to tell us what the significance of a Cabinet conclusion is?
Yes, so you would have a Cabinet paper. I think in this case it was on EU exit. And at the end of a Cabinet paper, there are normally a set of actions proposed. And this would have been one of the actions proposed in the paper on EU exit. The fact that something is in the Cabinet conclusion does not necessarily mean there was an active discussion on that particular issue. So this is E, so there would have been 5 points in the EU exit paper. I have, as you know, I have contemporaneous notes of some of these meetings. If we had had a discussion on independence and the Constitution, it would have been in my notes. I was the chief political advisor to the government. It is not. So my recollection and what that tells me is that there was no substantive discussion on issues around independence and a referendum at this meeting. There was a discussion around EU exit, and this had been included in the paper.
We've already discussed that there's a place for formal structures and informal discussions within the decision-making process. One can't get any more formal in terms of decision-making than what's in the Cabinet minutes as the agreed actions. Do you accept that?
Yes.
And it carries perhaps more weight about what the Scottish Government is seeking to do than informal notes that may exist, this being in a Cabinet meeting minutes.
Normally I would agree with you, and in the other points I do. What strikes me about this point is it was agreed that consideration should be given. It wasn't agreed that we would do something other than think. And following this period, no action is taken on independence or a referendum during this period, so to the end of 2020. If it had been, I would have been involved in it. There is nothing that I am aware of that the government proactively did. If the government had proactively done something, there would be much evidence of it. There would be published papers, there would be statements, and there would be occasions in Parliament. This was a focus on the fact that we were about to leave the EU, which was, during 2020, the dominant constitutional concern of the Scottish Government.
So when do you say that independence became a subject matter under discussion in the Scottish Government during the pandemic?
It generally didn't. So I worked on the pandemic March 2020 to March 2021. One of the first steps we did was suspend work on independence in the referendum. The team that worked on it was disbanded and sent to work on COVID-related activities. There are a few references that I can think of in the programme for government of the following year. So that would be the programme for government 21-22, where there's maybe one or two paragraphs and they make clear that any action would be contingent on the state of the COVID pandemic. I don't think anything happens until at least after the 2021 election.
But there is, from late 2020, there's some press coverage where other politician parties are telling the Scottish Government to stop talking or concentrating on independence and focusing on the pandemic response. Do you recall those sorts of press coverage starting from late 2020 going into early 2021?
I think the constitutional position of the Scottish Government, and I don't mean to be flippant in this reply, but any breath of the word independence would lead the opposition parties to say you are focusing on independence over the pandemic. You could have been working 18 hours, 20 hours a day on the pandemic, not seen anything on independence for the course of the year. It would not stop an opposition member saying that we were focusing too much on independence.
I will come back to the topic of independence. Can we look now at your notebook? And this is at INQ 000346141. And just before we look at the specific page, can you explain what the purpose of your notebook was?
I kept notes through most of the year on COVID of cabinet meetings, of COBRA meetings, of SCORE meetings, in essence to keep myself right in what had been agreed, what had been discussed, what my actions were, what I should be expecting different parts of the government to deliver over the week. It was my way of keeping on top of what was happening.
Can we turn to the entry on page 142? And you'll see at the top, this is headed Gold Command, and these appear to be your notes from a Gold Command meeting that took place on the 28th of September 2020. Can we now turn over the page? And if we're able to increase the size on the second page shown on the screen. Thank you. Just by way of, I think we would, so just by way of context, first of all, are your notes on a discussion of a potential circuit breaker lockdown around, I think this was being discussed in September going into October 2020, is that correct?
That's correct.
And if we are able to look at the, I'm just waiting for these, it's the next page. And it might be if I can read out
Yeah.
your notes, that might assist. I think we almost had it, but I'll read. So there's,
I can just about read this. So
yes,
you
so
need to
there's
carry on.
there's a note that's written on, yes, I think that's perfect. Thank you. And it reads, navigate economy, avoid blunt instruments. Then it says, I think, is it FM or FH? No.
I think that's FM.
FM, no finances.
Oh, no, sorry, that's FH. The next line down is FM.
Yes, who could you tell us who?
That would be Fiona Hislop.
Fiona Hislop says no finances. And the First Minister says, starting point, how do we reduce impact of spread with minimal economic impact? And then there's your handwritten note, political tactics, calling for things we can't do to force UK. Do you see that?
Yes.
So your note suggests that the Scottish Government's political strategy was to create what might be seen as a public spat with the UK Government to force their hand. What was the political advantages of that sort of strategy?
It's not about a spat. This would be about putting pressure on the UK government. It's not deliberately falling out. In the ideal world, they would have accepted the points that we were making to them. If I can give a bit of context and then get to that, this was weighing up how we could put further restrictions on potentially a circuit breaker with minimal economic impact, because the Scottish Government didn't have the means to provide economic support to individuals or businesses if we went for the full circuit breaker. What we needed was the UK Treasury to open up additional funding, to extend furlough, to take actions that would enable us to do that. And this, I think, is about us setting out very clearly what we wanted to do in public health terms, but what we couldn't do to try and build pressure on the UK government, who were not amenable to this discussion in private, to force a change of position.
And you would need to do that publicly, and that's the reference to the political tactic,
Yes.
Is that correct? We've heard evidence from witnesses, including Professor Davy Sridhar, of the importance of cohesion in the response between the UK government and the Scottish government, and this is in the context of public health. These tactics, whether you can call them political tactics, of going public, would create more division with the UK government, wouldn't they?
As I said, in an ideal situation, the UK government would have agreed that funding would be provided so that the Scottish government could put in place the public health restrictions that we wanted, and then there would have been no need for any pressure. Sorry, it's disappeared from the screen. The purpose of this is not division. It's not to have an argument. It's to be able to put in place the public health restrictions that we were being advised were required at that time. When private discussions do not get you to the place where you have access to the finances that you need to do that, you have to explain to the public why you're not doing it. And in opening that up, it's been very clear that it is the UK government's decision not to provide finances that is impacting on your ability to put in place the public health measures that you want. I don't call that a spat. Although I wrote political tactic, it's not partisan. It's not about boosting or, knocking support for one government or one party. It's about trying to do the job that we were trying to do and finding ourselves very frustrated in doing.
And why did you feel, in terms of intergovernmental relations, that you needed to go public with your concerns and you weren't able to raise these privately with the UK government?
I think there would be a number of issues that we would resolve privately, but this one was not being resolved privately. We were in this position, the Welsh Government were in this position, the Northern Irish Government were in this position, and we were making no headway. So you reach a point where you have to say to the people you represent why you are not able to do something that you are being advised to do. That means going public on the fact that you can't afford it. That means going public on the fact that you may have asked the Treasury for money and they're not providing it. It's not we are doing this to stir up political contest. It's we can't do what we're trying to do and we need to tell you why.
Can we go back to your WhatsApp messages? And this time, my lady, I wanted to give a warning that there will be some bad language in some of these.
I'm used to it.
Yes, I think it's partly for the broadcasters rather than your ladyship.
Apologies, I thought I'd been quite restrained.
And we're looking at page 20.
Oh, it's not my language.
Yes, and just to give some context, On the 31st of October 2020 at 6:30 p.m, Prime Minister Boris Johnson began his address announcing the second national lockdown. And I want to pick up the messages between yourself and Nicola Sturgeon, which start 10 minutes into the address. So if we read the first message, on the 31st of October at 6:40, you say, hitting the 15 minutes between the rugby and strictly to lock the country up. Let us never do this like this. Nicola Sturgeon replies, their comms are behind awful. We're not perfect, but we don't get nearly enough credit for how much better than them we are. She then replies, this is fucking excruciating. Their comms are awful. Then she goes on to say, his utter incompetence in every sense is now offending me on behalf of politicians everywhere. You reply saying, I have a separate WhatsApp with, and the name's Redacted, and Davy, and we are offended on behalf of spads everywhere. Nicola Sturgeon says, he is a fucking clown. So, was there a perception amongst Nicola Sturgeon and the wider Scottish Government that it was doing so much better than the UK Government in the pandemic response around this time?
I think this refers specifically to the communications aspect of the response. And that's sometimes dismissed, but communications is very important in a public health situation. People need to know what to do and why, and to understand it and to trust in it. And this was the end result of a day that had been quite shambolic in the UK government. And that has an impact on what people see and think in Scotland about the pandemic as overall. So while he was announcing something that was not relevant to Scotland, this sort of chaos that appeared around some of the decisions they took, we then had to work hard to mitigate because people in Scotland see both. And so, yeah, we were clearly not very complimentary about their communications handling that day.
Is it fair to say that the relationship between Nicola Sturgeon and Boris Johnson, by this date, had completely broken down?
I think broken down to a degree overstates what was there to break. They had met on a number of occasions. There was always a politeness, a business-like approach to it. When Boris Johnson first became Prime Minister and came to meet Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland, they had a discussion that I think has been described publicly as well as it was more like a debate, two intelligent people engaged in discussion about policy issues. When we got to COVID, I think it was much harder. It was evident in his exchanges with the Scottish Government, with the First Minister, and I think with the other First Ministers, because we would all be on the same call, that he didn't want to be on those calls. He wasn't necessarily well briefed on those calls, and he wasn't listening to the points we were making on those calls. And so I think engagement with him came to be seen as slightly pointless during this period.
And I think it's going as early as it was March 2020. I think in one of your notes you described Cobra as a shambles.
Yes.
Was that the view that you had from very early on, from March 2020, that the Prime Minister wasn't really wanting to engage with the Scottish Government?
Yes.
And how did that then affect, from the Scottish Government, its working relationship with the UK Government and the working relationship between the First Minister and the Prime Minister?
I think in relation to the Scottish Government and the UK Government in broader terms, there was fairly constant and fairly good communication and cooperation. I think particularly in health, this is evident, and at times, not always, but at times in the economic space. And I think officials at all levels sort of had discussions that were quite good. But the discussions between the First Minister and the Prime Minister and other First Ministers, I mean, it was never bilateral. There were always the First Minister of Wales and the First Minister and Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland on these calls as well. They didn't get us anywhere. So we started with a very clear approach that we should all try to work together, and moving into lockdown was all done in a coordinated fashion. But when you got to what I think the First Minister wanted to be substantive discussions about what direction to go in, a thrashing out of different proposals and different ideas. That wasn't what we got. We got a Prime Minister who, it certainly felt at the end of the video screen or at the end of the line, was reading a script and would summarise the contributions of the three First Ministers and the Deputy First Minister from Northern Ireland in ways which largely ignored the points that they had made.
And how early on in the pandemic response did you come to that realisation?
It was difficult. I mean, it was more effective at the beginning, sort of March, although it was obvious that they were not, hugely keen on having us there and being in the room. It was actually quite effective with Dominic Raab for the period in which the Prime Minister was in hospital. And it's when the Prime Minister sort of re-engages in the discussions that it is evident, as you're talking about, the lifting of restrictions, for example, changes in messaging, different approaches between Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and the UK, that he is not informed and doesn't want to be there.
And I think there seems to be kind of a very clear divergence in messaging from around the 10th of May 2020. You'll recall that's where the UK government messaging stayed to move to stay alert. The Scottish government remained at stay at home. Was that the point, if we're trying to identify in terms of timeline, where there was now clear divergence in the approach between the two governments? Or did it occur earlier than that?
I think that's the point where it becomes clear that there is going to be a difference in approach between the two governments, that the approach to lifting restrictions in England is going to be different to the approach to lifting restrictions in Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland. And that I think the sort of philosophy or ideology behind the lifting of restrictions was coming from a different place. So that is, I think, the point at which it becomes clear that we're going to go in slightly different directions, and we have to try and work out how to go in different directions within the UK as a whole.
If the First Minister of Scotland thought that the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom was a clown or utterly incompetent, that doesn't really create any sort of functioning relationship between the two leaders of the respective governments, does it?
I mean, this is later than that point that you raised earlier about May, by which point I can't think of conversations in this period that were happening directly with the Prime Minister. They were happening with Michael Gove.
Can we now turn to page 21? And we've now moved on to the 1st of November 2020. And I wanted to look at messages that begin at 6:29 p.m. Mm-hmm. And here you say, and I quote, "My reason for setting a timeline for them to answer us on furlough is purely political, especially as we expect the answer to be no. It looks awful for them, and creating that kind of pressure could possibly result in a yes, though agree we shouldn't bank on it. Think I want a good old-fashioned rammy, so can think about something other than sick people?" And Nicola Sturgeon replies, "Yeah, I get it, and it might be worth doing. I've sent a rough formulation of what I might say tomorrow. I could for it in there." So if we pause there, can you help us? What do you mean by good old-fashioned rammy with the UK government?
I think this is an expression of frustration that we were not able to manage the pandemic at this point in time in the way that we wanted. And I mean, a good old-fashioned rammy is language I would rarely use, actually, but, is that we needed to have the argument in public. There were a lot of things in COVID where we didn't have the argument in public. There were a lot of things in COVID where the UK government did something and we just let it go, or they didn't do something and we just let it go. I particularly felt this issue of furlough at a time when we wanted to apply restrictions and furlough was ending was materially important to the handling of the pandemic. It was a hindrance to our ability to handle the pandemic. And I can't deny, I was angry about that position because it really did block our ability to do what we wanted to do. So I think the message reflects that frustration, perhaps bubbling over a little bit.
Yes, I think earlier on we'd looked at your notebook and the entry from the Gold Commands from the 28th of September, and I think you'd said you'd taken issue with how I'd characterise it as a public spat. by this stage, on the 1st of November, you are looking for a public spat with the UK government. Is that fair to say?
I am definitely looking, I'm clearly looking to air the issue strongly and publicly. And as I say, in the vague hope that it might get as an answer, might get as a yes.
We're looking for a public spat.
I'm looking for a public spat for a purpose. Public spat could often deliver results. If the public pressure on the UK government was there, it had been shown in the past that they would sometimes change their mind if they felt that pressure. And what I want them to do is change their mind.
So the discussion is whether the furlough scheme should be available to Scotland, because at this stage, England had just entered into the second national lockdown in England. And you're setting what is effectively a political trap for the UK government. If it refuses to extend the furlough scheme to Scotland, it looks awful for them and strengthens the argument for independence, because you need to go alone. Or if it extends the furlough scheme to Scotland, there is additional funding available to Scotland. Therefore, for the Scottish Government, a good old-fashioned rammy with the UK Government is a win-win situation. Is that not the essence of the point that you're making here, that you're looking for this from purely political perspectives?
I would dispute that there's any issue of independence in this. So I am keen, very keen, that we get a yes in this situation and that we are able to enact the restrictions at the time, public health restrictions at the timing the Scottish Government deems appropriate, with the financial support that should come with that. If there is a no, what looks awful for them is that they are not enabling us to take public health steps at the time that we want. If the wider world wants to read constitutional implications into that, that is for them, but I was not making them.
And it was around this time that I think the furlough scheme was extended to Scotland in November. Is that correct?
It ultimately was. There was significant pressure, public pressure, placed on the UK government. Ultimately, it did it because it did it for England. And this was the issue, was that finance decisions that related to mitigating public health measures were not coordinated with the decisions each of the four nations might make on those public health measures. They were only triggered, if you like, when England took a decision, and Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland all faced significant difficulties during this period for that reason.
Can we turn to now page 23 in these WhatsApp messages? And here, just by way of context, what's being discussed here is efforts to have a four nations approach to restrictions over Christmas in 2020. And you'll see messages from you that begin at 9:04 p.m. And you say, Gov want to talk tomorrow, it's just come in, have said to, and there's a name redacted, to hold off going back till the morning and suggest waiting for the proposal before agreeing. Nicola Sturgeon replies, I've just seen the email. I'm happy to do calls subject to proposal, but I wonder if we should make clear in advance we won't agree anything without Cabinet approval and get Wales to sign up to that. You reply saying, yep, Cabinet Tuesday is a good marker. Tuesday or Wednesday might not be bad days for us to announce either. I'm increasingly leaning to just one other household after seeing the poll, but I'm also a Grinch about Christmas. And then Nicola Sturgeon replies, I am too. But on this, I reluctantly think there's merit in the UK-wide position. Let's see the proposal. So Nicola Sturgeon's reply to you on the 20th of November she seems to be emphasising that she's reluctantly seeing the merit in the UK-wide position. Does this not suggest that by this stage, the default position for the Scottish Government was to be different from the UK Government?
I think it was the default position for each of the four governments to take the decisions that suited their geographical and pandemic-related circumstances. It was not that we would be different to the UK or different to Wales. It was that in taking the right decisions for the people we were responsible to, the Scottish people, they were not necessarily the same decisions that the UK was taking.
But Nicola Sturgeon doesn't appear to be very enthusiastic about four nations approach by this time, does she? Where she's almost reluctantly having to sign up to it.
I think there was a reluctance in general around Christmas positioning. We were essentially bounced by the UK government into a position about Christmas. Telling people they can't have it when the UK government have said you can was a very difficult situation to be put in. there is a reluctance, and you can see this higher up, subject to the proposal. We're reading in the public domain that people will be getting some sort of relief from COVID over Christmas. We have not seen a proposal that we are about to go onto a phone call and be asked to agree to. So this again goes to some of that, what was to us a chaotic and shambolic sort of approach. So it's very hard to sign up to something and to enthusiastically embrace something that you have had no input into.
Were your advisors, whether it be scientific, clinical or medical advisors, advising you about the benefits of having a cohesive approach across the UK around the restrictions over Christmas 2020?
Yes, to an extent, in part because of travel. And it was travel that led us largely to look for a cohesive approach. What I recall of the advice from advisors around Christmas was, we don't think this is a good idea. Make it as minimal as you can if you have to do it at all.
I now want to move on in the period to, you left your role as Chief of Staff in March 2021. And you say that after a short break, you came into the role of Strategic Political and Policy Advisor to the First Minister in August 2021. I think you say in your statement that you didn't have any involvement in the pandemic response beyond this date, except for COP26, which took place in Glasgow, I think in November 2021. Is that correct?
That's correct.
On the 7th of September 2021, Nicola Sturgeon announced that work would start again on the second independence referendum campaign. Does this announcement, or did this announcement coincide with your change of position from Chief of Staff to becoming the Chief Political Advisor and Strategic?
It broadly coincides in date terms, but it doesn't coincide in reason. I did not take a post. My post was not involved in any move on independence. I attended the odd phone call, but it was far from the principal purpose of my job.
What was the principal purpose of your job after August 2021?
Initially, it was the COP26 summit and to lead the sort of Scottish Government's policy work in preparation for that. It was then to focus, and this was something I had felt as Chief of Staff we were missing, was to step back from the front line, from the media, from the Parliament, from the day-to-day, and to focus on some of the long-term commitments that we had as a government and that we'd made in the 2021 election around moving to renewable energy, around reaching net zero, around tackling child poverty. So I worked on things like the new economic strategy, the draft energy strategy, the resource spending review. I attended some of the Constitution Secretary's independence meetings, but I did very little work on it. It was not my purpose.
So, just so I understand, in your role as Strategic Political and Policy Advisor to the First Minister, and this is around the same time that there's this movement towards a second independence referendum, your position is that you didn't actually do very much work on independence.
I didn't. There was a delegated special advisor whose role was the Constitution. He covered Brexit primarily and the development of the work on independence. I think it might be useful to say I had not been in government over that summer, and I think that there's been a reference on Material provided me, a BBC article sort of headlining this independence issue on that date in September that you remembered or cited, which is, again, the publication of a programme for government. I had no involvement in the writing of that programme for government. Unusually, it was the first one in probably 10 years that I hadn't been part of. And it has maybe a page's worth of references to independence in a 180-odd page document. It was a programme for government that set out, as we had in the election, a number of key policy objectives within government. And I had moved to lead on those policy objectives because I had a reflection, which the First Minister had shared, that you needed a special advisor who could work across portfolios with her confidence to try and inject some energy into them.
Did the move towards pushing for a second independence referendum, did that reflect a change of priority for Nicola Sturgeon away from the pandemic response and to the second independence referendum campaign in middle of 2021?
At that time, no, for her. I mean, I wasn't there day to day, but my recollection of her in that time is that she remained incredibly focused on the COVID pandemic. you can think about more than one thing at a time when you're First Minister, but she devoted vast amounts of time to the COVID pandemic during this period still.
Was she devoting vast amount of time to the independent strategy around this time?
It was largely led by the Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution.
I wanted to move on to another area, and this is around the public health messaging during the pandemic. You say in your first statement, and I don't intend to bring this up, that you have considerable experience in public communications. Is it fair to say that until at least March 2021, you played an important role in the Scottish Government's communication strategy in relation to the pandemic?
Yes.
And this included leading on, for instance, the preparations for the daily media briefings. Is that correct?
I would share that responsibility with the head of the COVID briefing unit, but yes.
And in fact, we've seen some WhatsApp messages that you were actually one of the people that would decide, for instance, which advisor would appear on any given day. Does that accord with your recollection?
Decide is possibly strong. I would suggest you would come on what day. They would tell me what days they were and were not available, and we'd work out how we were going to cover the whole week in coordination with the Health Communications Desk.
Were you the one effectively choosing, at least before checking their availability, who would be the one that would front a particular media briefing?
I generally sought to simply just share it around and consider what each of them was working on and what we were likely to be speaking about. So if we were going to be speaking about a piece of Public Health Scotland work that had come out, I would probably look for Professor Smith, Dr. Smith, to do that. If it was, we need to give people a general update on a reminder about behaviours because the polling maybe shows that behaviours are slipping, I would look for Professor Leach to do that.
So in broad terms, what was the Scottish Government's strategy around public health communications, at least until the period that you were in position?
It was to be honest, to be clear, to trust people, and to try and build cohesion amongst the public about the actions we were asking them to take. There was a lot of focus on explaining to people why we were asking them to do certain things, because that would boost the compliance, helping people understand the situation they were in and that we were in, and encouraging the behaviours that we needed people to undertake in order to mitigate the spread of the virus.
I think you said to be honest with the people, to be clear, to trust the people and try and build cohesion amongst the public so that the public, you were able to explain to the public and the public understood why they were being asked to comply with various measures. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And can you tell me the importance of honesty, trust, being clear and transparent with the public in terms of public health communication strategy?
I think to ask people to do something as extreme as, stay at home was something that was very unusual and unprecedented in people's lives. They had to have confidence that the people who were asking them to do that were asking them to do that for the right reasons, and that it was something that we were asking of everyone. And part of that was helping them to understand why it was necessary and the impact it was hoped that following that rule would have.
Could there be sometimes good reasons not to be open or candid or transparent with the public? And if so, what sort of scenarios would there be where you wouldn't be open or transparent with the public?
I think I can perhaps identify where you're taking me here. There would be occasions around patient confidentiality, particularly early in the pandemic when not at the time, but subsequent to, there have been arguments that people should have known more, that we should have said more to the public about certain events and certain cases. That is an argument that has been made afterwards, and I think we can say very clearly we told people about cases. We perhaps didn't tell everybody about the personal circumstances of individual cases. So I think that may be where you're heading. I think that is the main issue where you would keep something confidential, is if there was harm that could be caused to an individual or to the process of managing COVID itself by making something more public.
I think you probably were able to anticipate where I wanted to go. I wanted to ask you some questions about the Nike conference, which took place between the 25th and 27th of February 2020. Can we look at INQ 000225995? And what this is it's a chain of emails in which it's between yourself and Dr. Catherine Calderwood, and you'll see that other people copied in include the First Minister's office and indeed the Cabinet Secretary for Health. And if we look at what is being discussed here is whether to disclose the link between the conference and the first outbreak of COVID-19 in Scotland. And if we see, this is an email from you saying all CabSec, FM and Gregor, can I just pause there, is that Sir Gregor Smith?
Yes, it is.
Who can discuss directly what we're looking for, are conscious that a number of Scotland's cases now connect to one event, and that we are at a point where that could be reassuring information for the public around the increase in numbers, demonstrate we're still at containment, that contact tracing works and be a legitimate public interest matter. Ahead of the updates to numbers at 2 p.m, can FM and CabSec receive as full information as possible about that event, what's been done, the contact tracing success, etc., and can consideration be given with comms as to what can be said around it? So I asked you about Professor Smith. Does this indicate that he was providing advice, information and advice on the Nike conference around this time?
I think what happened, not specifically on the conference, I think the reason I'm referring to CabSec FM and Dr. Smith at the same time is from my recollection, he had come from a meeting of SAGE to report to the Cabinet Secretary and the First Minister what had been discussed and to update them. And so they were all in one room at this point. At the same time, we were becoming aware that I think it was the second case and then a couple of subsequent cases of COVID originated with a particular event. I can't say at the time that I knew it was a Nike conference until the following email. And in a discussion with the three of them, we collectively thought, well, perhaps we should, if we tell people about this, it might reassure them that we don't have COVID's bringing up in lots of different places, although perhaps in hindsight we did, but that these 3 or 4 cases, I think it was, are all from one event.
So at least your email seems to suggest that you and potentially the First Minister, the Cabinet Secretary for Health, Jean Freeman, and perhaps even Professor Smith were in favour of telling the public about the link between this one event and the number of Scotland's first known cases of COVID-19. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think the Cabinet Secretary, the First Minister and myself were, and Dr. Smith was asked, you know, do you think we can, and had advised that yes, he thought we could, hence why I'm saying he can discuss directly what we're looking for. He had given us a bit of advice on verbally on, you know, there'll be limits, but yes.
So he had given you advice saying that this can be, the link
That's
can
my
be disclosed
recollection.
to the public.
Yeah.
If we then turn to page 1, which is a reply from Dr. Catherine Calderwood, and you'll see that this is on the 6th of March, and I wanted to look at the final to the end of that first page. Her response is, my strong advice would be not to say anything here specifically naming the conference risks breaching patient confidentiality, as a delegate list will be available. So you've received some advice from Gregor Smith saying that he thinks that this can be disclosed. And then the CMO at the time, Dr. Calderwood, says her strong advice is not to disclose. At the time, did you think Dr. Calderwood's advice about not saying anything was the correct position?
I suppose I didn't think it was necessarily for me to judge the correct position. I would still have favoured making information available, but she was the doctor, she was the senior clinician, and she cited patient confidentiality, and ultimately the First Minister accepted that advice.
Would it not have been entirely possible to tell the public about what had happened without breaching patient confidentiality?
That was, if you like, the purpose of my request in the email to say, can we have some advice with comms about what can be said, I think is how it's framed, something like that. Was I was asking, what is the boundary of what we can say? What's the limit? Dr. Calderwood, I think, probably had a concern heightened because the first case of COVID in Scotland had media on their doorstep and had, you know, been named as an individual, but it was quite well known who that person was. This was cases, 2 and 4 and 5, I think. So I think her concern was that it is quite easy to find people in Scotland, and she didn't want to open that prospect up. That's my speculation as to why she was so strong on the patient confidentiality issue here.
Does this not give the impression of a cover-up because the link only becomes known to the public after a BBC Disclosure documentary in May 2020, and that's when we're still in the first lockdown? Does this not impact the public's level of trust in the Scottish Government's messaging?
I mean, as I've said, my preference was to say that there were a number of cases connected to a conference. I don't think this is as you've described it, because the cases themselves are publicly identified, like not identified as individuals, but the fact that there is an increase in COVID cases, that there have been 4 or 5 cases, is not kept within the government. That is published in the statistical update that went out every day. So that is known, as are the health boards in which those individuals are located. I think I understand why people think, we should have said this was a conference. I thought that at the time, but I can also see the view that Dr. Calderwood had, that actually you had people who were in quite a vulnerable position and you could be putting undue pressure on them at a time when they were unwell.
My lady, I'm conscious of the time. Would this be a good time to break?
Certainly. I have one question on. I confess I don't quite understand Dr. Calderwood's advice. The delegate list will be hundreds on it?
I can't recollect the size of the conference.
Chances are, if it's an international company like Nike, it's going to be.
I honestly can't. I think that is actually contained somewhere in this Freedom of Information request, but I can't recollect it.
And I do understand what you say about easier to find people in Scotland. I can't make the link between a delegate list being available and the patients being identified. But did you or the First Minister not challenge that assertion?
I can't remember. This is a question that you would need to put to the First Minister, that there may have been a conversation after this advice. But this was at a time when I think if you were told this was patient confidentiality, you didn't necessarily feel like you could challenge that. And, the next day there were 5, 10 more cases and it quickly moved on.
I think you could challenge it, but there we go. Right, I shall return at 11:30. Mr. Tarrant.
Good morning again, my lady. We had just finished speaking about the Nike conference. I now wanted to move on to INQ 000346141, which is again your notebook that we looked at in the morning session. Can we look at page 37? And you'll see that this is an entry that's undated, but if you see at the top it says, "Not to be public, French national, other conditions, limited factual information." Do you see that?
Yes.
And there was an article in the Edinburgh Evening News suggesting that the first death from COVID-19 in Scotland was a Frenchman who had attended a rugby international. I think it was the Six Nations between Scotland and France on the 8th of March 2020. Why were details not publicised at the time that the fact that this person had travelled from France to Edinburgh to watch the rugby?
So what was publicised at the time was that an individual had died and that they had another condition. This refers to advice. I can't remember who I was being given it from, but it's clearly a note of somebody telling me that we are not to release the fact that they were French. Again, this is not an issue about trying to avoid disclosing the fact that they had been at the rugby. I think, from memory, though my recollection is not entirely clear, that this was either about family contact or an issue to do with the French consul and their sort of involvement in the fact that the person was French and needed repatriated. It was not anything to do with the fact that they had travelled from France to the rugby. It was some element of the procedure around the death.
I think Dr. Calderwood had said at the time that the patient was an older man who died under the care of NHS Lothian. did that not give the impression to the public that the first person to die from COVID-19 in Scotland was a local person and not a Frenchman?
It may have.
And had the Scottish Government told the public that the first person to die from COVID-19 in Scotland was a French national who had travelled from France to Edinburgh to watch the rugby, would this not have led to some uncomfortable questions for the Scottish Government's role in allowing the match to proceed in the first place on the 8th of March 2020?
It may have, but that was not the reason for not disclosing the fact that they were French, as far as I can recall. There was no discussion about, did this or did this not relate to whether or not the rugby should have gone ahead. This was an issue about the patient, the person who had died, and as far as I can recall, either their family or the procedures around working with the French government.
But telling the Scottish public that a French national had died would not breach patient confidentiality when there's potentially hundreds, if not thousands, of people travelling to the rugby from France, would it?
It would not. And again, I would say I did not know the individual was connected to the rugby until shortly, a few days afterwards, from an external source.
Also, if it was to do with contacting the family and the French consul, surely it would be not to be public until family informed or something of that kind, wouldn't it?
It may have been, that may have just been shorthand, but the death was to be announced kind of straight away. The French part was not to be public, certainly at that time. I can't recollect if there was you can say this afterwards. But I did not know in this note that they were connected to the rugby. So the issue of not revealing the rugby was not a concern in my mind.
That became known pretty soon to the Scottish Government, didn't
Yes.
it? And there was no decision made that we need to be honest, I think your word, honest, clear with the public, trust them, and tell them that the first person that died from COVID-19 was in fact a French person who had entered Scotland to watch a rugby international that the Scottish Government hadn't tried to stop.
I think it became known to me, certainly, that they were from the rugby. At the same point, it became known to the public through other means. I don't disagree with what you're saying. The circumstances at the time were that a lot of the time you were simply just chasing your tail and you moved from one thing to the next very quickly. The moments of reflection that you're perhaps suggesting would have led us to say, oh, actually, that death from 2 days ago, we can now confirm this, just didn't occur.
Could another way of looking at it be that this is another example of a Scottish Government trying to cover up what might be seen as uncomfortable information during the early months of the pandemic?
That would be an inaccurate way of looking at it.
Before the break, I'd asked you about what good reasons could exist for not telling the public, not being honest with the public about events happening during the pandemic. And I think you had said you'd identified patient confidentiality, which we've discussed. But you also said it might be that one can't tell the public because for the purpose of the process of managing COVID itself by making something more public. Can you explain what you meant by that?
One of the issues around the Nike conference, and I think it was perhaps the subsequent line of Dr. Calderwood's email, and was the contact tracing, and that you, or certainly clinicians, quite often at the very beginning, wanted this to conclude and to be done in a contained way rather than to create some sort of panic, if you like, around people who would not be contact traced because they hadn't, in their view, been exposed.
But does that not contradict what you said earlier on about the values of public health communication, being clear with the public, trusting the public?
It is a balance. So you lean towards always putting the information in the public domain. There has to be a reason to not put the information in the public domain, and that reason has to be, clinical, scientific, proven to be worth it. But these are, a very small number of examples, and I can think of no others, to be honest, where information about COVID cases that we had, particularly in the early days, once you got to larger numbers, the detailed information was not something that, we had unless there were specific outbreaks, was not put in the public domain.
Does this not suggest that there wasn't really a kind of concrete strategy that we have to be honest, candid with the public, transparent at all times, but it was just a matter of discretion, whether the Scottish Government felt perhaps this is a matter that we should not disclose, and this is a matter that we should.
The principle was that you were honest and transparent and put as much information as in the public domain as you could. My understanding, and I'm not the doctor here, my understanding of patient confidentiality is that is an obligation on clinicians. So when they say that they don't want you to release something under patient confidentiality, I appreciate you said earlier, Milady, that you could push back. You do feel obliged to take account of that.
And I wanted to move on to a different topic, and that's the use and retention of informal communications relating to the pandemic, these being, for example, relevant WhatsApp messages. And I think it's important I place some context to my questions. You voluntarily provided the first batch of your WhatsApp messages with Nicola Sturgeon, along with the first draft of your statement in July 2023. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And these were messages between yourself and Nicola Sturgeon dated between the 1st of September 2020 and the 16th of March 2021.
That's correct.
So a period of about 6.5 months. We've already looked at some of those messages this morning, and those were the first messages that had been provided by anyone involved in the Scottish Government's response to the pandemic to this inquiry. Then in November 2023, there was in response to a further request by the inquiry, you provided a page of additional messages between you and the First Minister. Mm-hmm. And these were messages dated over one day, this being the 31st of August 2020 to the 1st of September 2020. And at the same time, you provided some additional messages between yourself and Jean Freeman, Kate Forbes and Shirley Ann Somerville. And these messages were provided after the inquiry had raised publicly concerns at the preliminary hearing about the disclosure of informal communications from the Scottish Government. And at that stage, when those concerns were raised publicly, you were still the only person who had provided any WhatsApp messages from the Scottish Government to this module. Then, in response to another request to Nicola Sturgeon for her messages relating to the pandemic response, she provided in November 2023 copies of the same first batch of messages that you had provided to the inquiry in July 2023. And I think she had said that those messages were not retained on her phone, but she held copies. Did you discuss with Nicola Sturgeon that you were going to voluntarily disclose some of the WhatsApp messages between you and her to the inquiry? And if so, what was discussed?
I told her that I received the inquiry's request. I told her that I had messages, that I was submitting them to the inquiry. When I submitted them to the inquiry, I also submitted them to the government and asked the government to pass them to the former First Minister. I asked the government to do the same with the messages I submitted from Ms Freeman, Ms Somerville, Ms Forbes.
Were you aware at that stage that she had deleted all of her messages from her phone when you submitted your messages to the inquiry and then passed them to the Scottish Government for her?
Yes, I think I had become aware at that point that she didn't have the messages anymore.
And are you aware of how then Nicola Sturgeon came into possession of those messages? Was it through the Scottish Government?
Yes, I asked the Scottish Government to pass the messages to Ms Sturgeon.
Why is it that you retained these messages, but she has not?
I can't speak for her. I'm not going to speculate on the reasons here, with the one exception of saying that in this conversation between us, I am the official. And she can answer if this is the case. She may have had reason to think, well, Liz has them. That's the official part taken care of because I am the official in that exchange. To be clear, all the sort of relevant, salient COVID management stuff in those emails is in the system in government, WhatsApps, in other forms. I retain messages for my reference initially. You know, it's good to be able to look back, similar to my notebook. You know, I can go back and check have things happened as and when they are supposed to have happened. I then thought I should keep them because of the nature of this inquiry.
So, just so I'm clear, we've looked at some of these messages, and I think we've agreed, tell me if I'm incorrect, that we've agreed that they place important context on some of the decisions that were being made. Do you accept that?
I do.
And those messages would be important to understand the how, the whys, the whens, the wheres of how the Scottish Government came to make certain decisions during the pandemic. Do you accept that?
I think they are important, but I think the how, why, where decisions are made is contained in the official record, or it certainly should be.
But they're important context,
Yes.
and they're part of the decision-making process. They might not be the only part of the decision-making process, but they're part of that process. Do you accept that?
Yes, to an extent, yes.
And you were her Chief of Staff
Yes.
during up till March 2021. Was it your understanding of the Scottish Government policies that these sorts of messages showing the decision-making should be retained?
I think I, in the second submission to the inquiry, have set out my knowledge of Scottish Government policies in this regard. In relation to records management policy, and I'm going to have to talk about the two policies to give the full context here. In relation to the records management policy, it's always been my understanding of the need, whatever form the communication takes, to put salient material into the official record. It's useless on my phone. It achieves nothing sitting on my phone. It needs to be somewhere in the government system to have any form of effect or to inform government's broader thinking. I, to the best of my recollection, was not familiar with the mobile messaging policy.
Do you know, as Nicola Sturgeon's Chief of Staff, whether she was familiar with the mobile messaging
I couldn't speak to that.
And
So you weren't aware of the policy that others have told me about, where they claim the policy was to delete a bedtime ritual?
I have no recollection. I can't be categoric because a lot of things in government would pass through my inbox, but I have no recollection of specifically reading that policy at any point in time. Private secretaries would, occasionally remind you to, manage your inboxes, manage your email. Mine frequently breached the government limits. So, there would be a need to make sure you were keeping the right stuff, get rid of extraneous material, not relevant material. But no, I have no recollection of having seen that policy. I can't say 100% that I didn't. But
even if you had seen it, would you have deleted matters that might have been subject to an FOI request?
No, I don't think I would.
No.
Or certainly not intentionally.
And I think you've said that it was your practice that the salient, perhaps, messages would be recorded onto the corporate record. Is that correct?
Yes.
So some of the WhatsApp messages that we've seen, which show some of the context or some of the decision-making process, was it your habit to then record those messages into an email so it could be uploaded onto the corporate record?
Yes, largely. It would not, and I think I said this out my own, it's not that I would write an email saying I have had a WhatsApp exchange with Nicola Sturgeon, and it might be I have been in discussion with, or I've, had an exchange with. It's reflective of the way in which I would have handled a conversation in the pre-COVID world, and actually during COVID, where we were in the same place, is you have a conversation or an exchange of discussion information with the First Minister, and for that to be useful to anyone, including me, it has to go into the system somehow. It has to be communicated to an official, to her private office. I might ask her private office to put it in. I might email an official. Some of this might have been, so if we go back to the weddings example, I think I would have been on Teams to the relevant official saying, FM's asking me this question. Can you provide me with information? I think you can see from the exchanges that they are very much about immediate issues. They tend to be about things that are happening that day, the next day, and are about coordinating some of those things. And so me simply knowing that does not facilitate the business of government. It needs to enter the record to facilitate the business of government.
But using that example of the number of people that can attend funerals or weddings, so would it have been your practice that you would have recorded that there had been potentially a decision or a view reached that the number should remain at 20 in a formal email or an email or some other form of written communication to somebody else?
On that specific one, I would expect some form of written communication between me and an official checking the facts, saying FM's asking. If there had then been a push for, she wants more information or she wants to question this, that would have had to have gone again into the formal record to say, can the First Minister get fresh briefing on this point, or can you ask the CMO to consider this point for the First Minister? So it may not have been in that case that I provide the First Minister with information and she doesn't ultimately respond to the point that I said, I gave her this information and there's nothing back, so let's stick with it. But I would certainly have said, she's asked me for this. So there is no awareness that the First Minister is asking a question about this. And I note in that exchange, I then say the note from the Prime Minister is coming to her, the Prime Minister's statement is coming to her. So I would expect it to be in an exchange of, do we know what they're doing? Can we have it?
But a lot of the context of that decision, and whether it's a decision, a positive decision, or one not to change the restrictions, was within the WhatsApp messages. And if I understand your practice correct, that context would not be uploaded onto the corporate record.
No, I think that context would have been there because it would have been the engagement with the official and the subsequent note going to the First Minister about the Prime Minister's statement would have been in the context of the Prime Minister is making a statement today. The UK are doing this, the FM is asking this, etc. That would, I expect, all be clear in whether it was an email exchange or a Teams exchange. That would, I expect, all be clear.
But not the communications between those two events that would place context on how ultimately the Scottish Government came to a decision not to change the numbers.
I think if you're asking, did I, transcribe verbatim? No. I treat those messages in the same way that I would have treated a conversation with the First Minister and input the material parts of the discussion to the system in order that they could facilitate the business of government or, be recorded in some way.
I now wanted to move on to a related matter. In your first statement, you said, and I'll quote this, I won't bring the statement up, I have indicated to the Scottish Government that I expect all messages to be submitted. Why did you feel the need to tell the inquiry that you had indicated to the Scottish Government that your expectation was that all of your messages would be disclosed to the inquiry?
I think the timing of this correlates to a UK government case about whether they had to provide messages that were not COVID related, about who got to do the, redacting, if you like. And the Scottish Government had said to me that I could wait for the conclusion of that before deciding whether to give you everything or to who was going to do the redactions. And my view was just give them it.
The messages that you have produced between yourself and Nicola Sturgeon cover, as I said, a 6.5-month period. Mm-hmm. And that's between the 1st of September 2020 and the 16th of March 2021. And then there's the later additional messages spanning one day. Is it fair to assume that you were in WhatsApp communication with Nicola Sturgeon about the pandemic before the 1st of September 2020?
Yes, it would be. I think at a lesser extent. And for the record, I would like to say that I regret not being able to give the inquiry those messages. I thought I had them, I have sourced them, I have done everything that I am able to do, as far as I can, to find them. I thought I had retained them, and they're not there.
Why do you say that you would be in communication with the First Minister before the 1st of September 2020 over WhatsApp to a lesser extent? We would be going through the first lockdown, for instance.
Because we were in the same place more than we were at a later date. So I think I attended St Andrew's House the vast majority of days, including Saturdays and Sundays. Every day there would have been a briefing. I would have been there from early in the morning until late at night, and so would she. So during that very intense period, the majority of the discussion that she and I would have about thrashing out what we were going to do would have been happening in person. But there would be some messages. I think a lot of them would have been logistical around the briefings, who was going to be there, the BBC are offering you an address to the nation, that kind of thing, if I had been in a different room, for example.
But there would also be, for instance, you weren't working with her through every night, that there would be, you would both go home, there would be messages that would continue, the conversations would continue sometimes over on WhatsApp. In fact, we've seen many of your messages that are late into the night. And those would be messages, for instance, around March 2020 that would shed perhaps some light on decision-making around the first lockdown.
I genuinely do not think there would be much of significance around early March 2020 in the WhatsApp messages between us and around the decision-making on lockdown, because those discussions and decisions, and I remember them very clearly, happened in St Andrew's House, normally with Dr Calderwood, Jean Freeman, and if you like, at that point, yes, we did go home, but I think there was very little time left in the day by the time I was going home in those occasions.
What happened to those messages that you're not able to provide to the inquiry?
As I've said, I genuinely don't know, and I regret that. I thought I had them. I'm not the best administrator of devices. I wish I did have them, and I can't say what happened to them. They're not there. I can't say whether I actively deleted them. I can't say whether they got lost. I don't know.
What efforts have you made to retrieve those messages?
I have used that phone, the phone I have now. There are 2 previous phones with that number. I have sort of revived them and searched on them. I have used every online tool that tells me how to extract information from WhatsApp that may be there. I can't get to them. And as I've said in my evidence, I haven't gone to the lengths of handing them to somebody to forensically source, but I'm content to do that if the inquiry wants me to.
Were those messages held on a personal device by you, a personal mobile
Yes.
phone? Did Nicola Sturgeon also use a personal mobile phone to communicate with you?
I believe so, but I'm not aware of the sort of details of what phone she had and what from, who provided it.
You were her chief of staff, weren't you, for
Her
about
phone-
6 years?
Her phone would be a matter for her private office, not for me.
Did she have a government-issued phone?
Again, I think she only had one, and who provided that phone is not something I can answer.
If she had one phone, and we hear evidence that it was a personal phone and that she never had a government-issued phone, did she use that one phone to conduct government business with you?
Evidently, we had discussions about government business on the phone that she had.
As her chief of staff, did you ever advise her that it might be a good idea to use a government-issued phone to conduct government business?
I don't know that I did. I'm aware that on ministers' personal phones, the government installs a sort of secure app. So I would be less concerned with the device and more concerned with the security.
Did Nicola Sturgeon also use an SNP email account for government business?
Not really, no. I'm aware of the exchange with Dr. Sridhar, Professor Sridhar, the other day. I do know that those exchanges entered into her formal account. So people can send, what people externally send you something on is for them rather than you, if you like. The obligation on you as a government member or a civil servant is to then put that into the system.
But if you're openly, did she openly volunteer her SNP email accounts to others to use for
You would need to ask the First Minister, former First Minister, these questions.
There was one further question I wanted to ask before I believe that there is a question from one of the core participants, and this was around the question is around advisors straying into perhaps political space. And there was a few instances, for instance, during the pandemic. I think at one stage, Jason Leach got into a Twitter exchange with Richard Leonard, who was part of, I think, he was the leader of Scottish Labour at the time. And I think we've seen WhatsApp messages where I think there's reference to you and Nicola Sturgeon speaking to Jason Leach and telling him to stay out of the political space. Do you recollect that?
I do. It's in, I think, the exchanges with Ms. Freeman.
And there's also, there was instances where I think Professor Sridhar spoke about independence and how independence would have led to the Scottish Government being able to better address the pandemic response. Do you remember those sorts of press articles?
I do.
And occasionally I think there was some pushback from opposition parties about the fact that an independent advisor to the Scottish Government was straying into constitutional arguments. Was the distinction between politics and medical or scientific or clinical advice always clear to the Scottish Government's advisors?
I think it was. So I had no conversation with Professor Shrida about her articles or any of her contributions. I think it is clear. I think it was clear. I think Professor Leach and Dr. Smith, they took on a communications duty that they were not used to, and they made themselves incredibly available to all forms of media. And again, they weren't used to that. And I think their, if you like, enthusiasm to try and give the public answers sometimes led to them accidentally overstepping a line that they would not be as well versed as I might be in seeing. So I would occasionally have conversations with Professor Leach, for example, if there was a political issue running in the day and he was going on the radio to say, if they raise this, you have nothing to say. This is not a matter for you. And you refer them back to the government or to a politician or to me. And he would sometimes ask ahead of things, if he knew that something was running today that was political, how do I get away from this subject? Because this is not one that I should speak to. But occasionally, and I think this is clear from the messages from Ms. Freeman, they succumbed to the pressure, I think, of being asked questions and feeling that they had an obligation to answer because they were out there to try and inform the public.
And that would create potential issues around trust of Scottish Government communications if some of the messaging coming from scientific advisors or medical advisors or clinical advisors was seen to be, whether it's party, political, it was perceived to be that way. That would create issues of trust, wouldn't it?
I have, I think, more faith in the Scottish public than some people do, that they are able to differentiate what is political from what is medical and clinical. And they watched a lot of information during that time. They watched these people give public statements a lot during that time. And I think the public knew. I don't think those instances had particular impact on trust.
My lady, there's no further questions from me. I
Just
believe...
before Ms Mitchell asks a question, could I just go back to, I'm afraid I don't have the inquiry number for the document, the Cabinet meeting of the 30th of June 2020, where there was a reference, and I appreciate you weren't part of the conclusion, you were there taking notes, observing, advising, whatever. But there are some people who might see the conclusion agreed that consideration should be given to restarting work on independence and referendum reflecting the experience of the coronavirus and EU exit. Oh, well done, thank you. I can't remember what page it is.
13, I think.
Oh, well done to you too.
Sorry.
No, not at all. Always accept help, thank you. Some people might argue that looks as if the Cabinet members who agreed to that conclusion we're going to use the work on the experience of the coronavirus crisis as part of an argument for advancing independence and therefore using it politically. When you see it's associated with EU exit, which obviously a lot of people in Scotland who didn't want to leave the European Union reflects badly on the UK government, it does look a bit as if politicisation of the coronavirus pandemic, doesn't it?
I think the fact that this says consideration should be given, my recollection, my view, my understanding, my experience of all of this period is that the consideration given was we're not doing this right now. There is subsequently, much after this, there has been a lot said and reflected on about the way in which people in Scotland looked to the Scottish Government to provide the leadership in the COVID pandemic and what they then felt about the constitutional situation. But our actions were not designed to produce that result. If the public were making their own decisions on that, we were not driving it through our actions on the pandemic.
It's not the point of my question, really,
Sorry.
which is that, well, no, I understand why you answered in the way you did, but my question is, doesn't it look as if at least some members of the Cabinet, and eventually the Cabinet agreed, to capitalise on the pandemic to advance the cause of independence? Doesn't that look...
So, as I say, the consideration given to this was not done at this time.
No, but
I think if you take the discussion that we had earlier about the difficulties of funding and financing the mitigations required for applying public health interventions, that was at times, not in our presentation of it at that time, but it did show, and arguments could be made at a later date, that there was a hampering that would not have been there had we been independent. But I would be at length to say to you that this was not done at this point in time. I have no recollection, no notes, no work. If anything had been done in this period, it would be publicly available. There would be, reams of evidence of the Scottish Government going out and selling independence during this period, and there just isn't.
Thank you. Ms Mitchell.
I'm obliged. Ms Lloyd, I appear as instructed by Amaranor and Company on behalf of the Scottish Covid bereaved. I'm obliged to my learned friend for his questioning, which raises a lot of issues the Scottish Covid bereaved are interested in. But I would just like to ask you one thing, and it relates to paragraph 42 of your statement. I don't need that brought up, but I'll just read it out so you can understand the question that I'm asking. You say, communication within Scottish Government and with stakeholders, while strong and effective under considerable pressure, could at times have been improved, particularly around the application of the framework and the application or the lifting of restrictions. Teams within Scottish Government did not always appear to be hearing each other, particularly on the interaction between economic and Covid harms. And economic teams did not seem equipped or prepared to explain to stakeholders why certain restrictions were in place and why decisions were taken not to lift them. Mm-hmm. Now, can I ask you to expand upon that in particular? Why do you think that was? And my second question is, if that being so, what could be put in place to improve it?
When your role, I think, as a civil servant, as a policy official, is to engage with stakeholders, it often becomes your job to listen to them rather than to make arguments back as to why the government is doing a particular thing. I think that's something I've experienced in the Scottish Government frequently. And the economic officials I found in particular, and they worked incredibly hard, I don't want to cast any sort of aspersions on them, when they were engaging with economic stakeholders, I felt, and had reports back from some of the calls, that they would not explain why certain things were happening. They would listen to why stakeholders perhaps didn't want certain things to happening, but they would not make the argument for. And I know that the clinicians who were often on these calls felt that they were sort of left to be the bad guys, if you like, explaining why we cannot open your pub this week or we cannot allow shops to open just yet, and the balance of the virus. In that particular case, I think this was a very difficult situation because you were taking actions to save people's lives, but they impacted people's livelihoods. And, you had to acknowledge that was a very difficult balance to strike. I'm not sure what can be put in place to deal with it. I think there are broader reflections on the government's engagement with economic stakeholders, which I think the relationship was not great going into it, so it deteriorated during it. But I'm not sure you can put that in place other than a sort of building the confidence of the officials that you are asking to explain the situation in the information that you're asking them to explain.
The reluctance of those people whose job it was to explain that and sort of pass that over on to those who were the scientists, as it were, is that a reflection of their anxiety about the information or just an unwillingness to be the ones who are breaking the bad news?
I think it's the reflection of the pressure you can feel in government when a group of people are telling you that they disagree strongly with the actions that you're taking. To be the one that has to then stand up for those actions, explain them, defend them, that can, I expect, and I think I understand this, feel like quite a burden on somebody. If you are in a call and there are 15 people telling you they're wrong, that you are wrong, they may be right, and you have a duty to listen to them and to feed that back.
Indeed, but
if you've been given information to put out there, it's your duty to put that out there. And I think people tended to step back a little bit when confronted with arguments against the actions we were taking.
Indeed, one would think it would be an important part of the communication between government and stakeholders that they listened to what they were saying. And if there was a good argument, which no doubt the Scottish Government would contend that their argument was good, to give that to them. So even if they didn't accept what it was, they understood. And what you were saying was that was lacking within the Minister's
I'm not saying they
ability.
didn't do it. I'm not always convinced it was done with a level of detail, understanding, explanation that was helpful. It didn't help bring people to a better understanding of what was happening.
My lady.
Thank you, Ms Mitchell. Just before you go, Ms Lloyd, may I ask you to help me on another matter in relation to M2? As you may have followed, I heard a certain amount of evidence about the role of special advisors in number 10 and the role of Mr Dominic Cummings as an example. You talked about there's a special advisors code that applied to, I think technically what happens is that the special advisors, as you were and Dominic Cummings was, are technically part of the civil service, but they don't answer to any of the, as it were, the governance or management structure of the civil service. They answer to the minister or the first minister or the prime minister.
Yeah.
And I just find that a bit troubling. I mean, don't you end up with a conflict then between?
I think it's how you do it. I don't think I ended up with a conflict. The Special Advisor Code sits alongside the Civil Service Code. You are governed by both, with an exemption from certain parts of the Civil Service Code that enables your political activities. And you are appointed by the First Minister. I think if you are conscious that the civil servants around you have to comply with the Civil Service Code, and they have obligations on them, then a conflict doesn't arise. And whilst the First Minister is, if you like, my line manager, the person that appointed me, the person that could fire me, I was cognizant of the senior officials in the Scottish Government and my relationship with them. So as much as I was sort of on a par, if you like, I knew that, I needed to be aware if they were unhappy, perhaps thought a special advisor was stepping over the line. That is a back and forth relationship. That's a relationship that exists because you build that relationship. But I don't think I found a conflict. And I don't think such conflict existed in the Scottish Government.
So it's not a question of improving structures or anything, you think it's a personality matter?
My views on the operation number 10 are available in my notebooks. I don't think I should particularly comment on the relationship between Dominic Cummings.
Probably pressed you too far. Thank you very much indeed, Ms Lloyd. Very grateful for your help. Right, I think the next witness is the First Minister, who has other demands on his time. And I think the hope is that he will be here by about 1:15, so we're going to have to take the usual
1:45.
1:45 start.
Obliged.
So everyone has a slightly longer lunch. Thank you.